Hey, I'm Bob at I Like to Make Stuff. Today I'm going to show you how to set up a Raspberry Pi arcade with zero programming. To get started, you'll need a controller board like this. This is called an iPAC-2. You'll also need a Raspberry Pi and then a small memory card. You can use a cell phone charger to power the Pi, a USB keyboard just for setup, and a 12-volt power supply to run the LEDs. Getting the Pi set up is really easy. You download a disk image, you take a simple application that's free that helps you put that image on your SD card, and then you're ready to go. There's really nothing to it, no coding necessary. You stick the SD card into the Pi, and then plug in the HDMI that goes to your monitor. Put your keyboard in, and your power in, and you're pretty much done. It'll boot up on its own, and you can navigate with the keyboard. The system even comes with Doom pre-installed. Now if you wanted to, you could just stop here and have an arcade that you played just with the keyboard. To put your own games on, you put them on a memory stick, plug it in, and then start it up. It automatically copies them where they need to go and enables the emulators that they need to play. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? To make custom buttons, I made the designs in Illustrator and then used this craft cutter called a silhouette portrait to cut them out of vinyl to make little stickers. Once the vinyl is cut, you cut a piece of transfer paper about the same size. This is kind of like really thin masking tape. You lay it down on the front of the vinyl and make sure you get rid of all the air bubbles. Then you can cut out the individual sticker pieces. To customize the buttons, you have to take them apart. It's really easy. You just twist the electronics and slide them out. Then the rest of it comes apart kinda as you would expect. Peel off the backing for the sticker, stick it onto your button, and then peel off the front. The design you cut is left there. You can even use the heat of your finger to slide it around if you didn't get it quite centered. Now for some wiring. You're going to cut several sections of wire. In this case, I'm just going to show you how to make one part of a daisy chain. Cut two wires, strip the ends, and stick them into a female connector. Crimp that down, and then you've got a joint. Now just do that for every single one of your buttons. You're going to make a daisy chain of red, of green, and of black. Then for every button, cut a single wire and add a female connector to the end of it. Now this control board is just a quick prototype. If you were going to make a real board or a cabinet, you have to spend a lot more time laying these things out. For this case, I just put them kind of where I wanted them to be and then marked a general area so that I could cut some holes. Put down a backer board to drill these holes just to minimize blowout. This 1/8" plywood is not really great for this, but it's what I had laying around. Once it's sanded down, I used a piece of 1x on the front and the back just to offset it from the table. There's going to be a lot of stuff underneath this. The joysticks have to be screwed on, so in this case I had to add a little bit more material so the screws wouldn't pop through the front. In a final control board, this wouldn't be an issue because you would want to use a thicker material as your surface. Then you can screw on your joystick ball and start dropping the buttons into the places where you want them to be. Each button comes with a ring that you screw on from the bottom to keep it in place. Then you want to lay it down and make sure all the buttons are turned the right direction. Each button has 5 terminals. The 2 on the sides are for the LED, the bottom is ground, and the 2 on the front tell the button to be opened or closed by default. You're probably going to want it to be closed. Go ahead and add the single wire to every one of your buttons, as well as the buttons on each joystick. The terminals on the control board coincide with the directions of the joystick, as well as a whole bunch of different buttons. Take each wire from the joystick and insert it into the correct terminal. Then just tighten them down with a screwdriver. Then go ahead and add all of your buttons. You want to make sure you get the right color LED with the right color casing, and you're going to have to fiddle with them a bit to get them all to fit. Then you're going to wire each one to its relevant terminal. The wiring is going to get really messy really quickly, and in a final board, you want to spend a lot more time on cable management. Add the end of your green daisy chain to one button, then work your way through the rest of the buttons. The loose end of your green wire is going to go into the ground terminal on your control board. Use the red daisy chain to connect one side of all the buttons. Use the black daisy chain to connect the other side, then connect the ends to the 12-volt power supply. Just plug it in and you've got awesome light-up buttons. Last thing is to plug the control board into the Pi with the USB cable. Boot it up, and that's it. So it really is that simple. You don't have to know how to solder, you don't have to know how to program, you just have to be able to strip some wires and crimp on some ends. And if you wanted to avoid that completely, you could buy a USB arcade controller that plugs right into the Pi. If you want to make the Pi a little bit more useful, you can add a USB hub and a Wi-Fi dongle. That way you can actually surf the web from the Pi, or you can connect to the Pi from your desktop via SSH. Now this is just the first step in a larger project for me. I'm going to build a full-size arcade cabinet, but I wanted you guys to see the first step, to see how easy it is to set up the controls and set up the Pi. You could stop at this point and have a really awesome project to show off and have something fun to play in your living room. Now the first question that everybody is going to ask is, where do you get the games to put on this? And I'm not going to tell you. According to US law, if you have the physical cartridge for a game but you don't have a machine to play it on, then you can legally own the ROM to put on a machine like this. If that's the case for you, be creative, you can find them, I guarantee it. So hope you liked this one, and if you did, let me know in the comments below or at ILikeToMakeStuff.com. You can find me on all the social networks. I've got a lot more videos and podcasts and live shows and all sorts of stuff. And if you want to keep up with the rest of this project, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. Hey, I'm Bob at I Like to Make Stuff. Today we're finally going to start the arcade cabinet. I wanted to start with the side panels first, so I printed out the plans and started to move those dimensions to the piece of plywood. Now to do this, I started with one corner and worked upward and outward from that point. You can easily measure the height of the whole thing, the width of the whole thing, and then start to make other points that you can connect with straight edges. That's how I did all the diagonals from this. I figured out 2 points and then just connected them with a ruler. After everything was transferred to the plywood, I cut it out just with a circular saw. It's pretty easy to get straight cuts with a circular saw, but you could always use a straight edge if you need a little help. On inside corners like that, you want to cut as close as you can, but you'll have to finish it up with a handsaw. In some cases I had to do plunge cuts, which are very easy to do, but just take your time and be careful. Basically, the blade is out of the wood, you press the front of the saw down, start the blade, and then slowly push it down into the wood. I used a flush cut saw to finish off these inside corners. You could use any kind of handsaw or even a jigsaw in this case, but these have a nice thin blade so they make a nice cut. With that side panel all complete, it was just a matter of making another one, which was really easy. I just lined up the bottom corners, clamped the pieces together, and traced the outside edge. I didn't have to measure or any of that stuff, and so this one went a lot faster. I cut this one out in the exact same way, and then moved on to the back cabinet. The main cabinet structures are made out of MDF for this, and then since I only had a big sheet, I had to cut it down into some more manageable pieces. The back section of this cabinet is the taller section, so I had to do a front and a back panel, as well as a top and a bottom panel. I ripped these down to the right widths and cut them to the right lengths, and then I had to lay out the places for the drawer slides on the inside. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. Since the electronics are so small, I'm going to make most of this thing storage. With these laid out, I just screwed in the drawer slides following the directions that came with them. And since these panels are going to get painted later, I covered the drawer slides with some painter's tape just to keep them from getting painted as well. With the slides installed on both pieces, I pre-drilled and countersunk holes in the top and bottom panels before gluing and screwing them onto the side panels. Basically, I'm just making a big box at this point. 3/4 inch MDF was overkill here, and so if you switch to 1/2 inch and you're following my plans, you're going to have to adjust a little bit for the dimensions. I cut a scrap piece to fit right in the middle on the back side just to hold the whole box in its shape. This thing was pretty heavy, but once I had it in place, I could start to see the structure coming together. Next, I cut down some more pieces of MDF for the front cabinet. It's basically the same construction, but shorter and faced in a different direction. Since this was 1/2 inch MDF, I didn't want to run a screw into the end of it and risk splitting it, so I used glue and brads to hold it together instead. To make the bottom shelf a little bit higher, I used a 1 inch spacer before I nailed it in place. Then I moved the spacers to the center and nailed them in place for support. I cut 2 shelves out of plywood and then a 2-inch strip to use for the bottom of the face frame. I moved the saw to 1 inch and cut out the rest of the face frame to put on the front of the cabinet. All of these pieces got glued and brad nailed in place with the overhang facing the inside of the shelves. You want it to be flush with the outer edge. On the outside face, I measured where I wanted the shelves to land and then used a speed square to make marks for reference. For each one of the shelves, I drew 2 lines 3/4 of an inch apart, which is the thickness of the shelf itself. This gave me a safe area that I could drill and countersink a hole through before I glued and screwed each shelf in place. I used the speed square to make sure that the shelves were perpendicular to the outside faces as well. This cabinet acts as the base for the control panel, but it's also hidden storage. I cut some more plywood down to make 2 doors to go on the front of this cabinet. Back on the side panel, I measured in from each edge 1 inch. I drew some lines and then measured those lines. They'll be used to make some panels for the top later. I lined up and clamped together the 2 shelving units. I pre-drilled some holes and then screwed them together. To attach the side panel, I drilled some pocket holes on the front, the top, and all the way down the back. I held the piece in place, lined up the back edge, and clamped them together. Then I drove in the screws. Since the screws are all coming in at different angles, they actually pulled the whole thing really tight. I drove some screws in through the wall of the bottom cabinet as well. I measured around the top corner of the back cabinet and then transferred those dimensions to a piece of plywood. I cut that area out on the table saw and then cleaned up the corner of the cut. I set this piece in place up against the side panel and traced its outline. Basically, I'm making a mimic of just that top section. This is confusing, but it will make sense in just a minute. I drew in 1 inch all the way around on all these lines. It should have been 1.5 inches, so I had to go back and add another line, another 1/2 inch in. But once I had this inner shape drawn out, I cut the whole thing out with a circular saw. One thing I haven't told you yet is that one side of this machine is going to open, so this piece is going to act as the structure instead of the side panel. I put in some pocket holes onto this piece and set it on the corner of the top of the machine. With it in place, I just drove in the screws, and then I was starting to see some structure up top. On the opposite side, I also measured in 1.5 inches from each edge, and I nailed in a few pieces of scrap to act as cleats. I used a digital angle finder to figure out all of these angles and wrote them in place so I wouldn't forget them. Then I cut down several pieces of MDF to act as the outer panels. I used a different gauge to precisely set the angle of my table saw blade, and then I cut down all of these panels to have the correct miters. I trimmed them until they fit perfectly, but once I had them right, I nailed the top one in place. I cut down the back panel just the same, but I didn't nail it in place. I want it to come out easily for access. Followed the same process for the panel that's used for the speakers, but once I got it fit correctly, I didn't nail it in place yet. First, I had to take apart some computer speakers to mount on the inside of the cabinet. I used a Dremel tool and a knife and all sorts of stuff. Turned out there was a hidden screw that I could have taken out and would have made it a lot easier. But once I got them open, I just pulled out the speakers. I kind of picked a random location 4 inches in from one corner and made a mark. I set the speaker in that corner and then traced it out. I did the same thing for the other side. I drew a line across this shape and then used that center point as a place to drill a hole. I drilled the 2 holes and made sure that the speakers fit. Once I knew that they fit, I went ahead and nailed in the panel. I got another piece of scrap and lined it up with the outer face of those 2 panels and nailed it in place. I measured the outside angle of these pieces and then cut some more strips with that angle to act as a bezel around the marquee. I put in the top and the bottom pieces because the side pieces don't have an angle to them. I just cut those pieces and fit them in place. Next, it was time for the box that goes underneath the control panel. It's really simple. There's just a bottom panel, 2 sides, and a front. There's not even a back piece. Fit these together and glued and nailed them in place. I set the box on the cabinet, pushing it all the way back and all the way to the side before pre-drilling and screwing it in. Next, I cut down the control board itself, and it was just out of a piece of plywood. Once it fit in place, I cut 2 little squares of MDF. I measured in from the front and the side of the control panel and then used some CA glue to hold these pieces in place. They'll hold it in the box once it's set in place. Next, I found the angle for the panel that holds the display. I'm going to use a 27-inch LCD monitor for this, but I kind of wanted it to look old school, so I decided to use the CNC to route out the opening for the monitor. I found the size of the actual display and made an outer rectangle for it. Then I made an inner rectangle just a little bit smaller. On each line, I grabbed the center of the inner line and drug it out to the outside. It gave a curve from one side to the other. With this on all 4 sides, it started to look like an old CRT monitor. I spun it around so I could have more of a 3D view, and then I pushed the top lines out some, so they had a slope and a curve. I set up a really simple toolpath in Meshcam and then sent it to the CNC. It took a little while to cut, and I had quite a bit of sanding to do to get the edges smooth, but it turned out pretty good. While I was waiting on the CNC, I filled a bunch of the holes with wood filler, and then after that dried, I sanded everything smooth. Using the same angle that I used for the display panel, I cut a strip of MDF. Then I marked it into 3 equal sections, and on each one, I drew kind of an S shape. On the bandsaw, I cut the straight lines and the curved lines, so I ended up with 3 sets of locking pieces. I grabbed one piece from each set and glued it to the back of the display panel. Once those pieces were dried, I put the display panel back in its final position and then glued the matching piece next to each one I had already put in place. These are glued to the top of the control panel, not to the display panel. But once all of those pieces are dry, they act as a locking mechanism, so I can slide the display panel in from the side and it stays in place. I made a template for laying out the holes for all the different controls and put it on the piece of wood with some spray adhesive. I put another piece of wood behind the control panel to help prevent blowout and then drilled all the holes. After they were all drilled, I just peeled off the template. As long as you don't use too much spray adhesive, it comes off pretty easily. I sanded down the top of the surface, even though it's going to get painted and covered with stuff later on. To mount the LCD, I first had to remove the bezel from the outside of it. This will help the actual screen to sit flush with the display panel that I made. Once you get one corner pulled off, it usually comes off pretty easily. I did notice that the buttons were loose in this case and I didn't want them to fall out, so I used some super glue just to hold them in place. I measured in equidistance on all 4 sides. That way I could find the center points vertically and horizontally. I did the same thing on the monitor itself and used a black Sharpie just to mark those points. I needed to be able to see the center point on the front and the back of the monitor, so I wrapped some blue tape right along that point on both sides of the screen. Now I could flip the monitor over, line up the tape with the pencil lines that I'd drawn, and then measure all the way around the edges to make sure it was centered. I wrapped tape around both items to hold them together to keep that position. Then I measured the depth of the monitor at a couple of different places and cut some spacers that same size. On each side of the monitor, I glued and clamped those spacers in place, trying to push them as tightly against the monitor as I could. I also made a couple of pieces to put underneath the monitor to hold it up. After these were all dry, I cut 2 strips of plywood to cross the back of the monitor. I screwed these into the scraps that I had just added, and this held the monitor against the display panel. Just removed the tape and slid it into place. That's about where we're going to stop for this one. That's the main structure, all the pieces except for the drawers. I'll show those in the next video. Still looking pretty rough, but it's definitely starting to look like an arcade machine. That's a lot of information, I totally understand. That's why I want to stop right there and we'll pick up in the next video. A couple of things that I know are going to get asked in the comments below. This design is original. It's based on me just like looking at a whole bunch of different cabinets, but it's not the shape of any particular cabinet. People are also going to ask, why did you do this? Why didn't you do this? The fact of the matter is this thing is mine. It's going in my living room, and so it's built to fit my space and fit my needs. If you're going to build your own, you should definitely customize it to be exactly what you want. If, however, you did want to make this exact same one, I've got plans available for it on my website. I'll link to it right here or down in the description. You can go get those. And by buying my plans, it helps support the videos that I make, and I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, I can't give you an estimate on cost or time to build this thing because it's been a really long-term project and I just haven't kept track of those things, honestly. If you haven't seen the original video in this series, be sure to go check it out because that sets up the Raspberry Pi and gets all the controls working. But in part 2 of this series, we're gonna paint the machine, we're gonna build the drawers, we're gonna put on the graphics, put on the trim, and actually make it look like a finished machine. When that video is available, you can get to it right here, or you could subscribe to my channel and find out exactly when that and part 3 come out. So that's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with part 2. Hey, I'm Bob and I Like to Make Stuff. Today it's part 2 of how I made this arcade cabinet. If you haven't seen part 1 of this project, you should probably go back and watch that because it shows the majority of the woodworking here, how I built the cabinet as you see it right now. But now I'm ready to build some drawers to fill up the back section. I made 6 drawers that were all exactly the same, so really it was cutting a lot of the same pieces over and over. I cut some short pieces for the front and the back of the drawers, and then 2 longer pieces for the sides. I used a stop block to make all these pieces the same length. That's really handy when you have to cut 12 pieces at the same size. Once I had all those pieces cut, I moved the blade of the table saw down so I could cut a dado on the inside of each piece. This is just a slot for the bottom of the drawer to fit in. The panel that I want to use for the bottom of the drawer and the blade are the same thickness, so I had to slide the fence over just slightly and then run all the pieces through again. This doubles the thickness of the dado so that the piece can fit inside of it. I cut down several pieces of plywood to use as the drawer fronts. They're taller than the drawer itself. Assembling the drawers is really simple, just some glue and brads to hold it all together. I wanted the drawer fronts not to have any holes in them, so instead, I pre-drilled some holes from the inside of the drawer so that I could run screws into the drawer face. I added some glue to hold it in place and then measured on each side to make sure that the overlap was even. I held the two pieces together with some clamps while I screwed them together. Then I made 5 more. I don't have a paint booth, so I made one, outside with some plastic sheeting. Really just enough to keep the wind and the rain off of everything. I used an HVLP gun for the first time, and I really liked how it worked out. I was using a really cheap one from Harbor Freight, so it's nothing special, and it took a little bit of dialing in to get the right amount of paint coming out at the right speed. But once I got the hang of it, it actually worked really well and gave me good coverage. I picked a paint and primer combo that was a high gloss finish, thinking that would be a good surface for the vinyl to adhere to. Looking back on it, I think a satin probably would have looked better overall and still given a good surface. It took a while, but I finally got all the different surfaces painted. Now the paint raises the grain of the wood a little bit on the first coat, so I went back and did some rough sanding on all the different surfaces just to get them smooth. The ones that were gonna be exposed, meaning not under vinyl, I went back and did another coat of paint on, but that's really not very much. The side panels are both gonna get wrapped in T-molding, and that needs to go in a slot. So I used a slot cutting bit in a router and ran around the perimeter of both side panels. Now this first one was easy because it wasn't attached to anything. I could clamp it down to the table and easily go around it. But the other one was already attached to the cabinet. I actually didn't have room in my shop to lay the cabinet down on its side, so I had to do it standing up. Learn from my mistake, do it before you assemble the cabinet. The graphics were printed by a company called Mastro Graphics that did a fantastic job, super high quality prints. You should definitely check them out. The artwork was done by my good friend Dave Montez. I asked him to draw our family as superheroes. Look at that. So to apply these graphics, I laid out the pieces of vinyl on the side panels and used some blue tape to hold it in place once I got it centered. There was a lot of fiddling to get it in the exact right position because it had to be right, but once I got it to where I thought it needed to be, I peeled off the bottom edge. I used a knife to cut off the backing strip and then laid down the first bit of vinyl. It's adhesive, so it stuck right to the material. I pressed down in the center and then used a squeegee to work my way to the outside, pushing air bubbles out on the way. That end held the graphics in position so I could roll them up to get them out of the way. I put a couple of drops of dish soap in a spray bottle of water and sprayed the surface lightly before peeling back the backing and laying down the vinyl. This water actually stops the adhesive from working for just a little while, gives you enough time to push bubbles out of the way and reposition if you need to. It's pretty handy and a lot easier to work with than I expected. I spent a lot of time getting rid of all the bubbles. When you design your graphics, you do them a little bit oversized and then you give the printer a cut line to cut along. This gives you a little bit extra material around all the edges that you can lay down so you get a nice clean edge. On each one of the corners, I made a slit with a utility knife so that I had a flat piece to lay down. I didn't have any weird corners that I had to crumple into place. These pieces overlap the slot that I had cut for the T-molding, so I just trimmed those out with a knife. This process takes a little while, but it's really important because you want all of these edges to be really crisp. They start to bubble up a little bit because they're going around a corner, so you want to make sure you go back and push them all down. Honestly, I could not be happier with how this turned out. It looks amazing to me. I picked some orange T-molding to match the colors of my whole machine. This stuff has a barb on it that fits into the slot on the edge of the side panels. I started just by pushing it in with my hands and then started to hammer it in with a rubber mallet. I didn't really think ahead about how this stuff would work in the corners, and so I didn't put that into the design. In this first one, I decided to cut through it, thinking I could make a nice clean seam. But it turns out that because of the curvature of the outside of the T-molding, it's actually pretty hard to do. So after this one, I realized that instead of cutting the outside of the T-molding, it actually makes more sense to cut the inside, to cut the barb. So in this case, I marked where the center point was, and then cut a chunk out that made it fit around a corner. This worked pretty well, and I got better at it as I went along. Now if you wanted to avoid that entirely, you could design your side panels to just have curves and no actual corners. That would make it a lot simpler. The material that goes on top of the control panel is not the same kind of vinyl. It's actually a thicker polycarbonate. It's the same stuff you would find on an actual arcade cabinet. I used the same spray technique as before to put this stuff down and was able to slide it around to get it into the position that I wanted. It wasn't lining up with anything except the front edge. Once I got it where I wanted, I used the squeegee to get rid of the air bubbles and push out the excess water on the front. The polycarbonate is a little bit too thick to wrap around the edge, so instead, I carried the design over to a regular piece of vinyl, put on a little bit of water, and then laid on the vinyl and then just lined up the artwork. I also wanted to get the seam between the two materials as tight as possible so it looked like one piece that was carried over the edge. I squeegeed out the air bubbles and water just like before, and then used a knife to cut off the excess pieces, so that the vinyl would wrap around all the edges and corners. For the excess polycarbonate on the top panel, I wanted it to be cut as close as possible, so I used a blade right along the edge. To cut out the holes for the controls, I flipped the board over and then poked a little hole in the middle of each one of the areas. Then when I flipped the board back over, I knew where to cut out. From this center point, I used a sharp knife to cut out each one of the circles around where the button went. I started out with this kind of pie shape, and it ended up being quite a bit of work. I tested the buttons and made sure they fit, and once they did, I went through and cut all the rest of them out. For the rest of these, I started at the center, went to the edge, and then around the edge. It was much faster, much easier. I fit all the buttons into their right place and then screwed on the nut for each one on the back to hold it in position. I put the joysticks in place and centered them within the hole and then traced the outline of the joystick on the underside. From here, I could start some pilot holes before screwing in each joystick. Each one of them get a cover to cover the hole in the board, and then I just screwed on the ball to the top. There's one more piece of vinyl that lines up with the artwork from the control board, but it actually goes on the cabinet. So in this case, I set it in place, lined up the artwork, and then taped it down. This told me where the edges needed to be, so I made just a small mark with the knife before taking it off and cutting it on my cutting mat. I used a straight edge just to have a nice clean cut. This piece got applied to the front of the control box, just the same as the other pieces. It was already cut to width, so I just had to line up the top with the top edge. I applied it, squeezed out the air bubbles and the water with the squeegee, and then wrapped the bottom around the bottom edge. The marquee was printed on a piece of Lexan that I sent in, and it has a solid white base on the back of it, so it has a nice even backlight. I figured out where it needed to go, and then used some super glue to hold it in. To cover the speakers, I found some cheap replacement speaker grills. These were a little bit bigger than the hole that I drilled, so I centered them over the hole, pre-drilled, and screwed them in place. I only had silver screws, so I just blackened them with a black Sharpie. On the back of the panel, I just centered the speakers over the hole and then screwed them in place. The drawer slides have a piece that comes out on each one of them, and this is what gets attached to the drawer itself. To keep them consistent, I pushed the slides all the way to the front and the bottom edges. This way all the faces will be flush when they're installed. When you push these back in, they lock together. I did the same thing for the other 5 shelves and then just slid them all into place. And it turned out to be a whole lot of storage. To mount the side panel, I used a 48-inch piano hinge. I found the center of it and cut it in half with a cutting wheel on my Dremel tool. I lined it up with the back edge and then marked the center of the top hole so I could drive in a screw. I did the first one by hand because I didn't want it to drift at all. This needs to be precisely lined up with the back edge. But for all the other ones, I pre-drilled the holes and then just drove in a screw. I lined up half of this hinge with the very top, the other half with the very bottom. So there is a gap in the middle, but it hinges just fine. To mount the side panel, I set it on the same size spacer that I had the machine setting on, lined up the back edges again, and then marked the point before pre-drilling and screwing it onto the hinges. The hinge works great, and all of that storage is now hidden. Alright, the cabinet is almost entirely finished. I got a couple of details to do next time, and we're gonna walk through all the electronics and get them installed. I can't wait to show you this thing in its fully completed form. I'm super happy with it. When that video is available, you can get to it by clicking right here, or you can go back to part 1 if you haven't seen that. If you want to build your own cabinet just like this, I've got plans available that you can download. And if you want to see what I'm up to in between these videos throughout the week, be sure to follow me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. I post there pretty often. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in part 3. Hey, I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today, we're gonna finish the arcade cabinet. This is part 3 of this project. If you've not seen parts 1 and 2, be sure to go watch those. They explain how I built the cabinet and put on all the graphics. Now, we're gonna put in the electronics. To power the cabinet, I got an extension cord, some wire, a switch, a receptacle, and some boxes. I cut off the female end of the extension cord and then stripped off the outer insulation. I also stripped off the insulation from each one of the inside wires. I measured the back of this remodel box and then drew a rectangle to match on the back of the arcade cabinet. I made this in a place to where it wouldn't run into any of the drawers that were on the inside. I drilled some holes in the corner and then used a jigsaw to cut out this rectangle. This box will hold the switch. I pushed it in place and then turned the screws to actually lock it in. I used a different type of box up top that was nailed into the top of the cabinet. I drilled a hole in the bottom and fed the extension cord through, and the other end of that came out through the switch box. I fed some wire through the switch box up into the top box. This is where the receptacle is going to go. I stripped off the end of that and just wired up a simple receptacle. Now I'm not an electrician, so make sure you do things in the correct way based on where you live. Once this was wired up, I screwed it back into the box and then connected the other end of the wire to the extension cord and the switch. The white wires go together, the green wires go together on ground on the switch, and then the black wires go to the brass terminals. I chose a black switch and a black cover plate for this just so it would blend in with the back of the machine. This is going to act as the main power for the entire cabinet. I plugged in a lamp just to make sure everything worked. Alright, we've got power going to the cabinet now, and a switch to turn the whole cabinet on and off. That power is going to feed several things. The Raspberry Pi and the monitor, the buttons, the speakers, and an Arduino and some lights. We're going to talk about those now. I'm not going to talk about setting up the Raspberry Pi or the buttons because I already did a video on all that stuff, and if you want to get up and running and actually get the system working to play games on, you can check that video out here. I'll have it linked and I'll have it in the description down below. Be sure to go check that out because that's kind of an important part of building an arcade. With the Arduino stuff, it's kind of hard for me to show it to you in the building process. I want to show you all the parts that are involved and explain what they do, because it'll be really hard for me to explain what things are as I'm actually installing it into the box. I understand that this is very messy and hard to look at. The base of it is an Arduino Uno down here with a relay shield on top of it. The relay shield allows you to control higher voltage electronics with a 5-volt Arduino. So the power to the appliance is actually running through the relay shield, not through the Arduino. There's just a control back and forth between these two things. I've got two spools of LEDs here and they represent different things. One represents the marquee because it's going to be colored separately from the other. The other spool represents the lights that go on the back of the machine, and they'll give you kind of a backlight against the wall to give an ambient look. I've got a mode switch here, and this switch is going to be mounted on the outside of the machine, and it will tell the machine to be reactive as people walk up to it or to be stationary. In stationary, everything is just on. The other position is going to be sensor mode, and that means the lights are only going to turn on when the sensor is triggered. So the sensor that runs all this is a PIR sensor, and basically it's a human sensor that can tell a human motion. And so it's measuring whether motion is happening or not happening, and it tells everything else to work accordingly. So when it sees motion happen, it's going to fade these lights up and then turn on some other lights. Once motion has stopped for a certain amount of time, it fades these lights down and then turns those other lights off. These are the other lights that are going to be controlled just through the relay. So I have a lamp here which is just going to represent the screen. It's going to be turned on and off with the relay. And then the buttons have LEDs in them, and those LEDs will be turned on and off with the relay as well. There's a lot of power happening here as well. This one right here is actually 5 volts powering both of the sets of LEDs. They're powering them directly even though they are controlled by the Arduino. The Arduino has its own power source. This extension cord here is just an example of what will eventually be in place, but for now this plugs in the wall and then the relay controls what actually gets through. So our lamp or our monitor and our buttons are going to be plugged in here so that they get turned on and off with the relay. Now the other end of this, the Arduino and the LEDs all get plugged into constant power. Just for the sake of showing that everything works as it should, I've got a few things set up that I'm going to change when it goes in the final machine. For now, when it's in static mode, meaning that the sensor is not doing anything, these are going to show up red and these are going to turn on immediately. And then in sensor mode, these are going to be blue and white, and you'll see them fade up when the sensor is activated, then these will turn on. When the sensor sees no motion for a while, they're going to fade down and then these will turn off. So let's give it a shot. We'll plug in the Arduino, and it's in static mode, so everything comes right on, and these are red. Eventually they'll be white or blue or something. So now I'm going to put it into sensor mode, and sometimes it takes a few seconds for it to switch. Alright, so I'm going to move my hand, those should fade up, and that should come on. There you go. Now I'm going to move my hand away from the sensor, so now that there's no movement in just a second, those are going to fade down and that's going to turn off. So there you go, it works as it should, it's just really messy. So now, before I put it in the machine, I'm going to move all this stuff to a little circuit board just to clean it up and make it easier to move around and make it permanent. Next I had to take the strip of LEDs and turn it into a panel for the marquee. I cut it down into strips that would fit across the panel and peeled off the adhesive back. When you put these back in place, you have to do it in the right order. They are directional. In fact, there's a little arrow on the strip itself. So I went from left to right, and then right to left, left to right, and went zigzag back and forth. When you cut strips like this, you cut along a point that has connections on both sides of it so that you can reconnect the strips. And in this case, I had to connect the end of one to the beginning of the other. I did this with some 3-conductor wire, just making sure to get 5 volt to 5 volt, data to data, and ground to ground between each strip. I also did a jumper between all the 5 volt terminals because I didn't want voltage to drop over such a long distance. I tested it out, and the fade up and down was really nice, and it's super bright. For the ambient lighting, I did basically the same thing on the back, but I only did 3 strips. I started it at the top so that the connection wires were pretty close to the Arduino and I wouldn't have any extra wire hanging around. I put down strips on both sides and then hot glued the ends in case the adhesive wasn't quite strong enough. I used some glue to hold the light panel in place along the top and the bottom, and I was too impatient for it to dry, so I just used some tape to hold it up there. I actually still have the tape in place, there's no real reason to move it. The last thing to do to the cabinet itself was to add doors to the front section. I followed the instructions that came with the hinge to find the place where I should drill the hole. I marked it with my ice pick and then drilled with a Forstner bit, but not all the way through the face. These are overlay hinges and they go in from the back of the door, not from the side. I set them in place and then used the speed square to square them to the outside edges. It's really important that 2 hinges are parallel to each other so that they can swing freely. I screwed each one of these in with 2 screws and did the exact same thing on the opposite door. These are concealed hinges so you can't see them when the door is closed. You just attach them to the inside of the face frame, which makes them really easy to add to any cabinet that you build. I was ready to install the electronics, so I drilled some large holes with a Forstner bit on the back of the control box, behind the monitor, and up top near the power. I did large holes because I wasn't exactly sure what all was going to have to go where. I wanted to hide the motion sensor so you couldn't see it, but it could see you. So on the inside of the control box, I drilled down with a Forstner bit, but not all the way through. In the center of that point, I went all the way through with a small drill bit, and then came up with a spade bit from the bottom to make the correct size hole. The sensor just dropped right in. I also had to drill a hole for the mode switch, near the edge. I used some hot glue to hold both of these things in place and then fed their wires through the access hole that I had added in the back. I set the control panel in place and put all of its wires through the holes as well. I plugged the controls, power, and the HDMI into the Raspberry Pi, set it in place, and slid on the monitor. I also put a keyboard in there for good measure. I got some basic magnetic catches to keep the side panel shut. I painted them black and screwed one to the inside of the cabinet. I put on the plate and pressed the door against it. It leaves a little mark which tells you where to screw it in. That one held alright, but I also added 2 of them underneath the control board. I moved all the electronics up top and plugged everything in, and the only real change I made was to use a single relay instead of the shield. It's powering the extension cord, everything constant is in the power strip. Alright, let's try it out. One thing I forgot to mention in the video is how I'm actually moving this thing around. I've got it sitting on 4 furniture sliders just like this. They have a plastic bottom and a foam top. They're sitting underneath the machine pushed in so you can't see them from the outside. But there's 4 of them and they carry plenty of weight, making it really easy to slide this thing around on hardwood or on carpet. There have been a lot of the same questions come up over and over about this project, so if you have a question, leave it in the comments below. I'm gonna try to do a follow-up video about the cabinet here pretty soon to answer some of those questions. But like I've told you in the past, I can't really give you a time or a cost estimate because this thing's been a long-term project and I haven't kept track of that stuff. If you've missed the earlier parts of this project, you should check out those videos here. If you want to see what I'm working on in between these videos, you can always follow me on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. If you want to make your own cabinet like this, I've got plans available for it on my website, and by buying those plans, it helps support these videos, and I really appreciate that. So that's it for this project, guys. The arcade cabinet is finished. I'm gonna go play it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Hey, I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today we're gonna make a bar top arcade using less than 1 sheet of plywood. A while back I made a full-size arcade machine. If you haven't seen that video series, you should definitely go check it out. A lot of people really liked that project, but it was also really big and just kind of daunting for some people to take on. So I wanted to do a smaller version for people who may not have that much room for a full-size machine or may not want to dump the money or the time into it. The electronics on this system are identical to the large one, so if you've seen those videos, you know exactly what to do. This is really just about building a smaller enclosure. We're also going to leave off some of the fancy things like custom graphics, but you could always add those later. Alright, let's build this thing. I took a SketchUp model and the profile of my arcade machine, took it into Illustrator and traced it, and then printed out that outline at full size. This printed out on multiple sheets of paper, so I just taped them together with some Scotch tape, and used some spray adhesive to attach it to the 1/2-inch plywood. I used a jigsaw to cut this shape out, but I didn't go right on the line, instead just a little bit outside of it, especially on the corners. The template peeled right off, and I used a belt sander to flatten all of the flat surfaces and round over some of the corners. I also used a file and some sanding blocks to get the whole thing smooth and round. This one would act as my template to cut out the other side exactly the same. I clamped it down to the plywood and cut a general shape out so I had a smaller piece to work with, and then I clamped them together and used a flush cut bit on my router to cut out the second one exactly the same shape as the first one. I drilled a small hole in a popsicle stick and then measured in 1 inch. I put my pencil in this hole and then dragged it around the profile of this entire piece of wood to give me an offset that was even from every edge. I drew some lines to square off these corners and then measured from point to point. These sizes are what I needed to cut out of the plywood. I used a guide on my circular saw to cut down this large sheet into smaller pieces to make it easier to work with. I cut the piece for the control board and then cut a few 1-inch strips. These strips got cut into small mounting blocks that got glued and nailed in place. These blocks are here to hold my pieces in place while the glue dries, without having to put in screws from the outside face. These blocks also set at the point where 2 panels will join together, so I know everything is going to line up and sit evenly. For the pieces that have a bevel on one end, I held them up to the drawn line and marked where they overlapped it. Then I turned the blade to match that mark and cut the bevel. For the most part, these worked the first time, but a few of them had to be tweaked to get the right angle. I laid the monitor on this panel and measured in the same distance from every side to make sure that it would sit right in the center. Once I had it right in place, I traced it and then used a circular saw to cut it out. You could cut these out with a jigsaw, but I don't get straight lines with a jigsaw when I use it, so I used a circular saw. I did use a jigsaw to cut out the corners though. In my large arcade, the monitor actually sat behind this bezel, but in this case, I just made it big enough to fit right around the monitor to make it easier and faster. It fit pretty well, so next I had to mount it in there permanently. I took the stand that came with the monitor and pulled out the metal bracket. I screwed this bracket onto a piece of wood and then latched it back into the back of the monitor. I laid a piece of wood across and then measured the offset from the back of my bezel piece and cut some spacers to fit. I laid a piece of plywood across the spacers and screwed it into my new mounting bracket. To hold the spacers, I just added some glue and put them in place and then flipped the entire thing over. I shot in a couple of brads on the front face just to hold these in place while the glue dried. Then I flipped it back over and put the monitor and the bracket back in place. I pre-drilled some holes down into these side panels and then screwed the whole thing together to lock it all in place. To remove the monitor, I just had to take out those 4 screws in the mounting bracket and it could come out. I added some glue, lined up the monitor housing, and then drove in a couple of brads just to hold it in place again while the glue dried. The next piece was just cut to fit. I cut it larger than it needed to be, held it in place, and then cut the bevel on the other side before gluing it and nailing it in. The marquee area was a little bit different. First I cut the bevel on the edge, then I cut it down to size, then I took it to the bandsaw and cut it into strips. Basically I cut the top and the bottom and the 2 side strips, leaving the center section out completely. I glued in the side piece here, trying to get the pieces as tightly together as possible, knowing there would be some small gaps to fill later. I added this top section and then reinforced it with another panel behind it. This is really just the same process over and over, making the panels to fit, making sure they have the right bevel, and then gluing them in place. But of course this was only one side of the arcade, so I flipped it over and laid it on the other panel, lining these pieces up with the line that I'd drawn before. I added some more blocks at all of the corners to hold them in place and give them a point to line up with. Then I moved it away and added a layer of glue in between my line and the blocks. I fit the whole thing back together and connected everything with nails where I needed to, and let all the glue dry. But I didn't attach the control panel, and that's because it needs a whole bunch of holes. I printed out the template for all of the controls and glued it on just like the side panel. Using a Forstner bit on my drill press, I drilled out all of the holes and then peeled away the template. I slid it in place to make sure that it fit, but it still wasn't ready to permanently attach. I cut a panel and glued it into the bottom just to hold the whole thing in shape and have a place to set all the electronics. Before painting, I needed to cut a slot around the outside to use for the T-molding. There's a particular slot cutting bit that I have for this, and I'll have it linked down in the description along with everything else. Basically, you put it in a router and then run it around the entire profile, and it cuts a slot made specifically for T-molding. I also had to do this in the front of the control panel. Then I just painted everything black. Really quickly, if you've never been to ILikeToMakeStuff.com, be sure to go check it out. I've got a lot more information about all of these projects, as well as a list of all the tools and supplies that you will need to make them yourself. I've also got a store where I sell t-shirts and stickers and pencils and digital plans for a lot of the projects that I make. So go check it out, ILikeToMakeStuff.com. After the paint dried, it was time to add the T-molding. You can just press this stuff down into the slot using your thumb. It adds a lot of protection and a really pro look to your cabinet. I'm going to stop right there and actually make a little change. Now the next step would be to mount all of the buttons in here, push everything in from the back side and connect all the wires, and then drop this in place and fix it permanently. The problem with that is that if I need to change anything on the underside of the buttons, like if a wire comes loose or something's wrong, it's going to be really hard to get to. So now what I'm thinking is actually mounting this board in place firmly, but then on the bottom of the machine, cut an access panel. There's really no reason to have a solid bottom down there, so I'm just going to cut out a section around here so that I can reach right up in and fix things if I need to. Since this was painted, wood glue wouldn't do much, so I used CA glue to hold the control panel in place. I used my vinyl cutter to cut out some logos to add to the buttons. Now I covered this entire process in the other videos, but it's pretty simple if you have access to a vinyl cutter. You have to take the buttons apart, but then basically you just put a sticker on them and then put them back together. I also covered the full wiring process in the other videos, so I'm not going to do that again here, but essentially you crimp on some connectors to the end of wires, plug them onto the buttons, and then the other ends go into the control panel. Once you have all the buttons wired and connected, then you have to make some daisy chains to connect all the lights and all the grounds between each one of the buttons. The LEDs in all the buttons are connected to a single power source that just gets plugged in. I went ahead and started mounting the electronics on the inside of this board and then added an LED strip along the top of the marquee. To make the marquee, I'm going a lot simpler than I went last time and cutting a piece of Lexan and using some stickers again from my vinyl cutter. Just a note here, I'm putting these on the back side of this plastic, so these were printed out backwards. To diffuse the LEDs behind this sign, I laid it on a piece of freezer paper and then cut it to size. I used some super glue to hold this on the back of the stickers. This probably wasn't the best way to do it. It didn't turn out great, but it looks alright. Essentially, you just need something there to diffuse the light. Again, I used CA glue to hold it in place and then turn on the lights, and it worked pretty well. I'm connecting this old monitor through an adapter to go into the HDMI. After that, I just put all the electronics in the back and used some hot glue to glue in some computer speakers and a power strip to get everything in place. This is kind of a lo-fi version, and this is a quick and easy way to get everything held in. I dropped the monitor in and screwed in the brackets to hold it in permanently. Now notice, I'm not putting a back panel on my machine, and that's because at Maker Faire, I want people to be able to look in the back of this and see what's inside. Obviously, you can add a panel to yours. I'm really happy with how this thing turned out, and it was actually really quick to do. I had to spread it out because of my schedule, but you could easily make this entire thing in a weekend. It's considerably cheaper than the full-size machine that I made because I'm using an old, cheap monitor. I got this for $10 on eBay, believe it or not. I'm using 1/2-inch plywood and not even a full sheet. Now people always ask in the comments of the other videos, where do I get the games for these? I'm not gonna tell you that, and I've said it in the other videos. Just Google. You can find what you need. Google. If you want more information on setting up the electronics or any of that stuff, be sure to check out the older videos. I'll have those linked down in the description. It's a whole playlist of 4 videos that you can check out. But one of the things that is not covered there that always comes up in the comments is how do you set up player 2? It's pretty easy to do, but it's not very obvious. I'm gonna put a link down in the description. Follow that if you want to figure out how to set up the second player on this. I hope you like this project, and I hope a lot of you will make this, and if you do, tag me in a photo on Instagram or on Twitter or something. I want to see it. I've got lots of other videos that you might be interested in. Be sure to check out the playlist for the full-size arcade if you haven't seen it. Don't forget to subscribe, and I have a second channel with some behind-the-scenes and non-project stuff. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Hey, I'm Bob at I Like to Make Stuff. Today we're going to make a new arcade cabinet for Mortal Kombat 11. Today we're going to start working on a brand new arcade cabinet. Now if you've been around this channel for a while, you've probably seen the cabinet that I made about 3 years ago. It was made to play retro games only. It was really cool though because it had pictures of my family as superheroes on the side. It was mostly empty on the inside, so it had lots and lots of storage. But this new cabinet is going to be entirely different. This one is going to be made for Mortal Kombat 11. Now since this is a modern game, we're going to have to use entirely different technology. It's going to be running on a PS4, and the cabinet's going to be different as well. Since this video is sponsored by Mortal Kombat, we're also going to have access to the actual graphics from the game to put on the sides as artwork. The cabinet itself is going to be made in a few different pieces so you can easily take it apart to move it, which was one of the big downfalls of my old cabinet. All right, let's go check out what's going to be on the inside. I made the old cabinet just to play retro games so the entire thing could run on a Raspberry Pi. And in those videos I showed you how to wire up the buttons and the joysticks and get it all plugged into that little tiny Pi. It's not powerful enough to run Mortal Kombat 11, so we're going to upgrade everything. We're going to have a 4K monitor here, and all the audio is going to go through this sound bar, and it's all going to be generated by a PS4 Pro. I've only got a PS4, so I'm going to test it on that, but they're going to swap it out for a Pro when we send the cabinet to them. But even though that's all modern, we still need to have an old school joystick and buttons. To make that happen, we're going to use this card. This emulates a PlayStation 4 controller unless you plug in whatever you want to it. Now you can plug right into these terminals, or you can use this. We're going to put a wiring harness on this connector and make it even easier to plug up all these controls. All the buttons and the joysticks get connected to this wiring harness just by sliding on these terminals, and then the whole harness gets plugged in right here to the board. And once you've got all the controls hooked up, you connect this board to the PS4 with the USB cable. So the technology here is really simple to put together, but the hard part is going to be building the cabinet. Let's go do that. I've got all the big rectangular panels cut out, and now we're going to move on to some of the small stuff. To cut these out, I've printed out some full-size templates of the shapes, and then we attach these with some spray adhesive. Now we can cut these out with the jigsaw. I used the jigsaw to cut out a few of these pieces and then switched over to the bandsaw because you can get cleaner cuts with the bandsaw and a thick blade. The plans we have for this cabinet are going to have full-size templates for all of these oddly shaped pieces, including the big side panels, so you can print those out at home or at a local office center to make all the pieces with whatever tool you have on hand. Luckily, we have a CNC, so we're going to use that to save some time. We've got all those pieces cut, so now it's time to start putting the whole thing together. Now this one's going to be assembled very differently than the last cabinet that I did. This one is going to be made in 3 separate sections so that you can take it apart in case you need to move it. The bottom section is going to hold the PS4 and the subwoofer, and there's also room for an extra controller and any other electronics that we need to stick in there. The middle section is going to be where all the controls are, and they will be routed down into where the PS4 is. Then the top section is going to hold the monitor, the soundbar, and the light above it. Once we get all 3 of those pieces together, we can stack them on top of each other, attach them to each other, and then put on the side panels. Let's do it. To get started, we're going to work on the control section first. The actual controls are going to be up here, and all this back section will be what supports all the monitor and everything above it. So I've got these pieces in place. They're going to be pocket holed down into this bottom surface, but to make it easier and to make sure that these stay parallel, I've made some spacers. So I can drop these spacers in place, push all these pieces together, and that makes sure that these 2 pieces are parallel. Then we'll put another spacer here to make sure that's parallel, and this one will go on the front face. I've got those 3 sections on. Now the front panel needs to go on, but it actually overhangs just a little bit. So we're going to add a spacer underneath this board so that it can hang down a 1/4 inch below this surface. I've got all the pieces put together for the center section. Now the control board is actually going to be a separate piece that will drop right down into this tray, and we're going to work on that later on. So next, let's move on to the section that's below this that this will sit on top of. The middle of the bottom section is going to have a coin slot in it, just like an old arcade would, although it's not going to be functional. We bought one that has all the guts in it. We're going to take this out and save it for a future project, possibly. But we're going to go ahead and lay this piece in place, trace the place to cut out so that it will fit in, and this will act as our access panel for the PS4 on the inside. Before we get too far in assembling this bottom section, I want to go ahead and drill some holes in the bottom panel and make sure to lift it up a little bit off the ground. And that's because we're going to put some leveling feet underneath it, kind of hidden behind this front face. So the front will be really close to the ground, but behind that we'll be able to screw these in and out to level the cabinet depending on where it's sitting. Probably a better way to do this, but I need to flip this whole thing over to put it on top of that so I can screw it on the same way I put on the bottom. So let's see if it works. We got the bottom two sections of this finished. They're roughed in and setting together, and you can start to see this thing taking shape. Now the next step is building the top section here that's going to hold the monitor and the sound bar and the marquee and all that. We cut some of those pieces on the CNC, so they're pretty much ready to assemble. But one of the things about cutting on a CNC is that the bit is round. So any inside corners you have are not going to be perfectly squared off like they would be with a saw. So for some of these inside corners, we're going to have to go back with a handsaw and just trim them up. I've got these pieces pretty much ready to put together, but I gotta make sure to do them in the right order. If I do the wrong pieces first, then I don't have access to put in the other pieces. Plus, before we put this whole thing together, we gotta make some holes for the sound to come through. I'm gonna go get the sound bar and the light to make sure we've got them in the right place. At this point, I'm just trying to figure out where to put the speaker grate so that the sound from the sound bar can actually come through. And on this sound bar, I can feel that the speakers for it are actually on the two ends. They're pretty far out. I wish they were a little bit closer to the middle, but that's what we got. So I'm gonna mount this pretty much in the center and then make a mark here. Then I'll measure how far that is from the outside edge and make a 3-inch circle that I can cut out and then put on the speaker grates. Since I'm going to be changing directions on this cut with the jigsaw a lot, it's going to destroy the top layer of the plywood. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of score it with my knife just to try to help that. This outer edge will be covered up with the speaker bezel, so you probably won't see it.
Just about ready to start putting the T-molding slot in all of the panels that are going to get T-molding. And T-molding is a little plastic piece that goes on the outer edge of the plywood to protect it, mainly from just being bumped, but it also kind of dresses it up a little bit. Now to make this slot, you use a slot cutting bit, and you have to make sure that you cut that slot right in the middle of the piece, because on the T-molding there's a barb that fits right down into that piece. So make sure you do a test cut to get your bit right in the middle of that 3/4 inch width.
I took the guts off the back of the coin door, and we don't need all these pieces. We need something that just returns the coin if somebody puts it in right back down to the little slot on the bottom. So I went into Fusion and I modeled up some brackets and this piece. They printed in 3 parts and they snap together just like so that when someone puts a coin in, it will automatically return it straight out the bottom.
Before we move ahead with making the bezel, we're going to go ahead and do some other finish work to get this whole thing into a single unit. I want to go ahead and screw all 3 of these pieces together so that they are locked in place. I want to add some edge banding here and get the marquee put on, and then go over the whole thing with a sanding block and some wood filler to start to clean it up. I've got a lot of the holes filled on the surfaces that are going to be painted. A lot of the edges are sanded down. Now we're going to work on the control board. This thing is going to be able to drop right down into this big pocket, and it needs to fit right here. The side panels are going to interact kind of in this corner, so we need to notch out this corner. I'm going to do that with a flush cut saw and make sure I clamp this thing down first. The reason I'm cutting this in place is because this cut actually needs to be at an angle. It needs to be parallel to this face right here, but this board is sitting at a 9.5 degree angle, so by cutting it flush to this face, we should get the right angle on the cut. Now that all three of these pieces are locked together, we can drill some holes because we're going to have to feed the wires from the back of the TV, from the controls, from the light, all that down into where the PS4 is going to be below. And since these pieces are locked together, we can drill through both of these sections at the same time. To make those holes, we're going to use a big Forstner bit so that we can put the end of big power cords or HDMI or whatever we need to. The hole will definitely be big enough. So I drilled through both of these pieces of plywood and then it just kind of kept going, and it turns out I was drilling right down into the top of the center support. So if you make one of these and you drill that hole, don't do it right in the middle of that panel. I've got a couple of pieces of wood here to wedge the soundbar in place in between these two walls. I'm also going to add some stuff on the front and the back, and then something to hold it down because we have to ship this whole cabinet all the way across the country. So we started making this bezel, and I was going to make it out of a 2x4, and it turned out that the way we had it designed was actually a lot more complicated than it needed to be. So we're changing the plan just a little bit, and instead going to make it out of a 1x4, cut down some of the thickness, and so because of that I'm adding a spacer to push the whole thing out. The plans we have for this thing will be updated and simplified. Now we're going to put a bevel on these inside edges just to give it a little detail. We'll do that on the table saw. All the vinyl came in for the graphics for this thing and it looks fantastic. We're going to work on putting this small little wing piece on to show you the process, but basically the entire process is just scaled up to do the side art. And I'm actually not going to cover it fully in depth because I already covered this whole thing in the original arcade cabinet, so if you want to see very specific instructions, go check that video out, we'll link it down below. After a couple of coats of paint, I went and lightly sanded this surface so it's nice and smooth. Now I'm going to take off any surface dust with a tack cloth. Now we take some lightly soapy water, just a couple of drops of dish soap, and we wet this down. And the water and the soap helps suspend the adhesive on the back of the vinyl just a little bit, and it gives you time to put it on and slide it around and get it placed correctly before the adhesive really grabs. So now that it's on there, we just take a squeegee and start at the center and push towards the outside edge, and that moves all of the air bubbles and that excess water and soap out to the edge and pushes them off. Now that I've got all of the air bubbles out, I've got to fold the excess vinyl around the corners, which is pretty easy except for on these rounded corners. Here, we're going to have to kind of make some cuts up to the corner so that the pieces will fold over a little bit easier and not overlap too much. Now I've got both of these wings done. The process is pretty simple, it just takes some time and some patience, but now it's time to move on to the big side. I've got the vinyl on the sides, they're all good to go. So the next step is putting down this polycarbonate on the control surface. It's a little bit thicker and more durable than the vinyl. And the only difference between this and the control surface that I did on my old arcade is that this has really precise locations for the buttons and for the joysticks. So we're gonna do it a little bit differently. First I've got to get this piece centered vertically and horizontally on the wood. Then I'll tape it down so it's locked in place. I'm gonna mark the center of each one of these crosses so I know where to drill the hole in the wood. Then I'll go back and apply this vinyl and cut out that section so that the buttons and the joysticks can drop right in. Now I've got all these marks where I need to drill the holes, but there's actually two different size holes. So I'm using a silver Sharpie just to mark where the small holes are going to be so I drill the right size. I've got all the holes drilled on the control board and they work fine for these larger buttons. They pass through just fine, but the smaller ones are actually a little short, so they won't go through this 3/4 inch material. So on the smaller buttons on the back side, we're going to drill in some larger holes so there's enough room to get the retaining nut on the back of them. Now that I've got the polycarbonate down, I can go back and cut out all of these circles, and to do that I'm going to use an X-Acto knife so I can get a really fine cut right up to the outside of the hole in the wood. I've got the buttons in, and now I'm going to move on to the joysticks. Now the problem here is getting the center of the joystick centered within the hole that I already drilled. If you flip it over, you can't see where this outline is. If you do it from the back, you can't see the hole that you're trying to center it on. So what I've done is measured the width and the length of this entire thing, measured the hole that it's going to cover, and then subtracted those things, and then made some marks on the outside so I can line up those marks, and theoretically, the center of this should be the center of the hole. Now we've got all the joysticks and the buttons installed, ready to go, so we're going to hook it up to the wiring harness like I showed you at the beginning of the video. The controller works, we've got it all tested. Now we need to make a way to keep it in place. So we've cut down these pieces and added some pocket holes. We can set them in place add some glue to the top of them, and then put the control board on top. The glue will hold all these pieces together, then we can lift it all out as one piece and drive in the screws. That goes in there, drops in place, and now it can't slide off. We're getting pretty close to the end here. It's time to put on the side panels and then these little wing pieces. To put on the side panel, we put some pocket holes here, here, and here so that we can put the side panel on, drive in the screws from the backside to draw it into the body. And then up here on this solid section, we're gonna drive some screws from the inside into the side panel to hold it up there as well. When I was putting the T-molding on this side, I didn't put any in this little section, and that's because it fits right underneath here. This whole corner down here is going to get covered up with another wing piece. I did some testing and figured out that because the soundbar doesn't have HDMI, it doesn't get turned on when the PS4 gets turned on. So rather than having to deal with turning it on separately, we just swapped it out with some inexpensive computer speakers with a subwoofer, and so they are always good to go when the PS4 turns on. The last thing to put in here is the marquee. We've got those graphics printed on a piece of Lexan, and then on the back of them is a solid white sheet to help diffuse the light evenly. We've just got to peel off this front and we can see what it looks like. Now I'm going to hold this in place so it doesn't fall backwards, and Josh is going to use a point driver to drive in some points to hold this within the frame. This is the same tool that you would use to hold a picture in a picture frame. Now that we've got the marquee in place, this whole cabinet is done. I'm extremely happy with how this machine came out, and I really hope the team at Mortal Kombat enjoys it. If you want to make one of these for yourself, we're going to have some plans available, and they are going to have templates so you can add your own custom artwork. I'm not going to show you any gameplay because there's a lot of kids watching, and it's definitely for mature audiences, but if you want to find out more about Mortal Kombat 11, we'll have a link down below. We've got tons of other types of project videos that you may be interested in. Check some of those out, and if you're not subscribed, do that as well. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. See you next time. On the old arcade machine, I ran, and the only difference between, what? Doodly doodly. The old arcade cabinet, let's do it. Hey, I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today we're gonna make a really nice piece of furniture that hides a 4-player arcade. Today we're back here at the office. This is our front room, our hangout room, our conference room. You may recognize our gaming table that we made recently. And we've also got the big wall back here to cover up the window. In those videos, we asked you for some ideas of what we should do in this space, and you absolutely came through in the comments. One of my favorite suggestions for this space over here was to add some arcade cabinets. But we've made 2-player arcade cabinets before. You can totally make one of your own, we've got plans for them, but not everybody has a spouse that wants to have a full-size arcade cabinet in their living room. So today, we're gonna make something that goes right here that would fit in anybody's living room. So the plan is to make a really nice looking piece of furniture to go here that anybody would want to have in their living room. You can mount a TV over top of it, but the real purpose is to hide a 4-person arcade cabinet in plain sight. So the first thing we have to do is head to the shop and build the basic structure, and then we'll talk about how it's gonna go together. I've got all the pieces for the white section of this cut out of melamine. We're using melamine for a few reasons. The big one is the cost. A sheet of this is half the price of a sheet of plywood right now. So it's just easier to go this way, cheaper this way. But it's also going to end up being white anyway. So since it has a plastic surface that's white on the outside, all we have to do is add some edge banding and it will be totally white. A couple words of warning though. This stuff is really, really heavy, so you probably need help lifting a sheet, and once you cut it, it gets kind of sharp, so you should probably wear gloves. And in addition to that, it handles a screw all right, but then if you try to take that screw out, it'll kind of fall apart. So you can either go to dowels or just put a screw in and leave it alone. We are going to be making plans for this thing, so we've already got a cut list, which is how I got all the different pieces cut. So now we can just take the basic box parts and start building the carcass. I'm going to be using just butt joints to put this together because a lot of this stuff is going to end up being covered up later on. Since this thing is big and heavy, I'm building it face down on the ground so that the shelf can be justified to the front, and to make sure it's the right amount off the bottom, I'm using the toe kick as a spacer. And so I'm just going to set it down here on the ground, make sure that it is flush with the bottom edge, and then that forces the bottom panel to be in the right place and I can drive in the screws from the outside. So I've got the outside shell done, but now I need to work on the interior support pieces, the ones that are like creating the sturdiness for the entire thing. And I've got kind of a weird situation where I need 3 pieces that need to cram together and then they go inside this outer edge. Let's go to the whiteboard and let me give you a better idea what I'm talking about, because this is a little confusing to look at. Upright, this is what it's going to look like. We've got the outer box and then we have this kind of cross piece that's inside, and this is what the actual pieces look like down here. So we've got this long shelf that needs to be sandwiched between the vertical pieces. So I'm going to put some dowels in this joint and in this joint, but from the side I have to make sure that those dowels don't run into each other. So they need to be offset a little bit between the top and the bottom. So I'm going to show you how to do dowels on one piece of them, but just know that this is kind of where we're headed. We're just going to use these little 5/16 dowels. And the way to do this is to have a matching dowel center. So you can drill a hole that's this size and then you drop one of these dowel centers in that hole. It gives you a nice point that you can press to the mating piece of wood and it makes a little indentation, and then you can use that point to drill a matching hole. Once you've got those 2 holes in line, you can just put in the dowel in one of them and slide the pieces together with some glue and your pieces should line up. So we're going to do this, and the first step is to put these 2 pieces together. Remember I said that the lines needed to be offset. So I'm going to make sure that I put a dowel on these lines on this piece and on these lines on this piece. So far I've got all of the fixed pieces, all the stationary pieces put in place, and you can tell it's just a normal shelf. In fact, you could put a face frame on this right now and have a really nice credenza to put underneath your TV. We're going to add some drawers in this section. Then we're going to add false drawer fronts up here to hide the arcade controls. We'll talk about that later on. Down here we're planning on doing adjustable shelves. So we're going to put in some shelf pins so we can make those different heights. And then there's going to be a false back on here to hide the empty cavity in the back section. That empty cavity back there is so that we can manage cables, because our plan is to put retro game consoles on these and have them plugged up all the time, so all of the cables will run back into the back section and be hooked up to the TV. You won't see any of that stuff. Obviously, you may not need that back there, but it is a good way to take advantage of some space that's behind the cabinet. So next up for me, I need to drill holes for the adjustable shelves and then start working on some drawers. This is a shelf pin jig. It's super easy to use, and basically you just line it up with the front edge of where you're going to put the pins, and then you decide where you want the first hole to be. It comes with a drill bit with a collar, so you just drill that first hole. Then you've got the hole, and it also comes with a pin, so you put this pin in that hole. Then you use that pin as a reference point for the next height. Then you can drill all of these holes and just keep moving the pin up. You can make a bunch of evenly spaced holes. So this thing works great for edges where you can get around like this, but back here I don't have an edge. I've just got a face that I need to match those holes on. On this jig, the edge piece snaps off. So now that I've got that piece off, I can just decide where I want the first hole to be, line it up with this shelf here and drill that hole. Then I can put the pin in that hole and use another piece of wood with a 90-degree angle on it as kind of an edge. Slide this up, put it on the pin, drill those holes, slide it up, put it on the pin, just like I would on the edge. This is the back panel, and I want it to be able to be pushed in from the front side and have a hard stop on the back to cover up all this hidden space in the back of the cabinet. So what we're gonna do is just take some scrap 1x, and I'm actually gonna glue and nail it to this top edge and to the bottom edge so that when you push in that false back from the front, it's got a place to stop. It's also gonna leave a little gap right here in the center so that all those cables can come through. Now I have to make 4 drawers to go in those, and I'm going to make them the simplest way possible. I've got 1/2-inch plywood I'm going to use, and so I think I'm going to pocket hole the front and the back to the side pieces. That way you won't see the pocket holes. One thing about that is, since the material is 1/2-inch, you have to use 1-inch screws. So there's not a lot of surface area, but between the screws and some glue, it should be fine for what we're doing here. So I'm going to cut these pieces down, add the pocket holes, and then once we get the outer box, we can cut the bottoms and just brad nail them from the bottom. Now it's time to put on some drawer fronts, and there's a bunch of different ways to do this, and it really kind of depends on the type of offset you're going to have from the outside edges from the other drawer fronts. I've got a 1/2-inch offset over here and a 1/4 inch on the bottom. So basically I went and found some scraps that are 1/2-inch material and 1/8-inch material, which I can stack up to make 1/4 inch material. So I'm going to use these different offset pieces to get the drawer front in the right position from the outside edge, and then I'm gonna screw it in place. But to hold it in place in the meantime, I'm gonna use some double-sided tape. So we're gonna put double-sided tape on the drawer, get it laid out in the right place and push it on. And then from the back side, we can push the whole thing out, clamp it in place, drive in some screws. It's very easy. We've got our row of drawers in place. They still need pulls on the front of them, but they're good for now. So next up, we need to start working on the piece that's gonna hold the false drawer fronts and the flip top. It's all gonna be one thing. So we've got this shell back here, and this is gonna be slid on top of this, leaving this gap up here, about right here. So basically what we need to do is make a piece that's an L shape. That's the top and the front. Get that all fixed together, and then when the hinges show up that I'm waiting on, we can actually hinge it on this face. We'll get to that later on. First, let's get this part made. So we've got another piece of melamine. This is gonna be the false back to the false drawer fronts up top, and it's gonna line up with the existing surface here. Then we're gonna put the other false fronts on these, and then this entire thing will be attached to this top section. And so you'll be able to lift it, and it will flip back and land back there, revealing all the stuff that's going to be on the inside of that. We'll get to that later, but first we need to get this piece and its top section attached. So these two pieces need to be attached to each other, and the best way to do that I can think of right now is to use dowels like we did before on this section. And so we're going to put them in the top of this piece going into the bottom of this piece. That way we'll have a whole bunch all the way along the run. It will lock those two pieces together because eventually you're going to have to lift on this edge to flip the entire thing. So those need to be a really strong connection. Before we do any of the doweling though, I'm going to go ahead and add the hinges. This is called an invisible hinge, and I've used these before on the secret door and on a ping pong table. And the cool thing is that it goes inside two pieces of wood. So it's completely hidden like this, and then it can open up so that the two pieces of wood can move 180 degrees. So it's great for a tabletop that needs to flip completely open or a secret door. And this actually goes inside two pieces of wood. So you have to make a mark across both pieces of wood where the hinge needs to sit. And then it comes with a nice little template that you can use to drill the holes, because you have to drill 2 different depth holes for this thing. Let me just show you how it works. So next up, we're going to put this false piece in place, add the dowels like I mentioned earlier, and then we'll put on the false drawer fronts on front of them. And at that point, the construction is pretty much done. Then we can move on to the hidden arcade controls that are going to be in here. First, let me get this thing finished up, and then we'll talk about the controls. These drawer fronts are going to go onto the front the same way we did the other ones, but I wanted to point something out. One of the downsides of using melamine is that if you don't have a specific laminate blade on your saw, it can chip a lot. And you can see back here, there's a lot of chipping on the back of these pieces. That's why I'm using the back. But you can fix it. So with some spackle, you can take just a little bit of the spackle and just kind of wipe it into the little crack in between the surface and the laminate that you put on the outside, the edge banding. And then once that dries, it will fill that space, and then you can do a light sanding and then run over it with a white paint marker, and it pretty much disappears. So it is fixable, but the way around all of that is just to get a laminate blade for your table saw. It's not something I use often enough to buy one, so I didn't use it, and you can tell. All right, let's get these screwed on. Now we need to put the pulls on the front of all these drawers, and I'm going to use this thing that I've used before. I got this when I was working on my kitchen cabinets, and it makes it really easy to make repeatable holes for a set of pulls on a bunch of different drawer faces. Once you get it set up and you have the vertical center and then the horizontal center, you can hold it in place and then drill right through both of these, and it'll put the holes in the right spot. This is our control board for our 4-player arcade. Now we cut this out on the CNC because we've already modeled all this stuff in Fusion, so it was easy to do the layout, the profile, and all that, and just cut it out of a piece of plywood. You could absolutely do it by hand. Some paper templates to cut out all the holes, to drill the holes, super easy to do. And when we have plans for this cabinet, we'll have that available as well. But now that we've got this, before we start putting on the graphics on the top or putting the buttons or anything in, we need to build an understructure underneath it. And that's because this entire thing is going to slide in and out of the cabinet, so it needs to be on some drawer slides. We've got some drawer slides that go on the ends that have a locking mechanism on them, so as you pull it out, it will lock into place, so while you're playing, it doesn't try to go back. So we need to make a little bit of a structure underneath it to mount those two. So we're going to put those on the outside and then build some structure, and if we need any more extra support underneath, we can add a couple more drawer slides on the interior section. All right, let's cut down some plywood and pocket hole it into place. So that's pretty much it. Now we have the outside edges where we can put those drawer slides. The little locking mechanism is going to stick out a little bit past it, so you can easily lock and unlock it. The last thing we need to do here is take a slot cutting bit and run around this outside profile, and that puts in a little slot where you can knock in some T-molding, just a plastic molding like most arcade cabinets have to protect this outer edge, and it'll dress it up so you don't see the plies. We've also got some graphics coming, and we got to put in all the electronics. But we recently did a live stream where we covered setting up the Raspberry Pi, setting up all the buttons, and getting those things attached. If you want to find out more detail about that process, go check out that live stream. Now we're gonna put some drawer slides on this thing, and I've got these locking drawer slides that are really cool. They've got a little knob sticking out on the front of them, and they're locked in place until you pull that knob down. And once that's out, then you can fully extend them, and they click into place so they are locked in this position. That's gonna be good while we have the control center out so that you can play on it without it trying to move away from you. Then when you're done playing, you just push this down, and it will collapse again and lock into place. So basically they go on just like every other drawer slide, they just have a cool locking feature. So let's get this thing in place. Now we have secret controls. Cool piece of furniture, open it up, cool controls, slide them out, they lock into place, play your games, and then two people can unlock it, close it up. The entire piece of furniture is finished, so let me give you an idea of what we're planning to do with it. We are calling this thing inside the office the Super Arcade because we want to have as many gaming consoles as possible. So down here on these shelves, we're going to put classic consoles, old NES, Atari, all that type of stuff on these shelves, and then we've got these gaps right there in the back corner where we can route all of the wires through from every console. Those are all going to go into this analog video switcher so that we can have them all plugged in all the time to one output that's going to the TV. And when you want to play a console, you just hit the right button and it turns it on to the TV. So we've got all of that down here, and then we have the actual arcade. And this is the Raspberry Pi Arcade. We've done a few of these on the channel, so you've probably seen them before. But we have some graphics that are going to go up here and on the control board. And these are things we got printed at a local print shop. They look great. But also, we're going to be adding controls to this board. We've got a lot of buttons, a lot of joysticks. In fact, we bought a set that has a USB controller that these things all plug into. It's very, very simple. We recently did a live stream where I covered all the specifics of getting these things hooked up and setting up the Raspberry Pi, so I'm not going to go over that again. But the live stream is up there if you want to go watch it on the channel. Let me get all this hooked up, and then we can finally play some games. So this thing turned out awesome. It's a great way for us to be able to play games together as a team, whether we're at the arcade or sitting on the couch. And either way, this thing is an awesome way to hide a fully functioning 4-person arcade in your living room. And if you want to make one of these for yourself, we're going to have some plans available, so be sure to hit the link down in the description. And if you make one of those, please send us pictures because I would love to see it. We've got a lot of other arcade projects, plus a bunch of other types of stuff that you may want to check out. And if you're not subscribed, be sure to do that as well. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Dang it. No, it wasn't. It wasn't what I wanted. Action. Mummeline. We're gonna start working on the actual flip tarp. New shelves with old game consoles. So you push that knob down, and then they'll slide out, fully extend.